It wasn't a forged iron sword, it wasn't a spear, and it definitely didn't have any sharp blades. If you looked closely, you'd see nothing but a piece of dead wood, knotted and brutally baked by the unforgiving desert sun. A crude tool, the kind you see tossed in the dirt without a second thought. But records from 3.5 millennia ago reveal a ruthless reality. That exact piece of wood, in the hands of an elderly fugitive, became the trigger for the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the ancient world. It was the instrument that broke the economic backbone of the wealthiest nation on Earth. It annihilated the elite forces of an entire army. And, defying every known law of physics, it ripped the sea wide open. Official Egyptian history might try to sweep it under the rug, but the historical trail of destruction is undeniable. We aren't talking about some cheap parlor trick. This is the raw, untold story of the staff of God. To understand the historical weight of what was about to unfold, you have to look at the man holding that piece of wood. At 80 years old, Moses was, by society's standards, a lost cause. An Egyptian fugitive who wound up a frustrated shepherd, wearing out the soles of his sandals in the brutal exile of Midian. Think about the culture shock. The guy who once walked the limestone corridors of Pharaoh's palace with absolute authority, who had access to the best military and mathematical education in the ancient world, was now spending his days reeking of the pasture. And that staff he dragged through the dust? To the mind of a former prince, it was the ultimate symbol of his failure. Leaning on a crude shepherd's rod was like carrying a daily certificate of defeat. It was just the working tool of a man who firmly believed his story was already over. But history has a habit of taking violent turns right when the powder seems wet. The ignition point happened at the foot of Mount Horeb, right in front of a burning bush that defied the laws of nature and simply refused to turn to ash. The encounter with the burning bush, documented in the 4th chapter of Exodus, isn't just a mystical event. It's the exact moment the tactical warfare of the ancient world suffers a total collapse. Faced with a divine calling, Moses tries to back out. He argues he has no influence, no army, and that absolutely no one in Egypt would listen to a washed-up old man. It's in that split second of extreme vulnerability that the Creator asks the question that altered Earth's geopolitics forever. What is that in your hand? God didn't ask how many bronze swords he had stashed away. He didn't hand him a tactical invasion map. He pointed at that old, calloused wood, dried out from daily use. "A staff," Moses replied. The divine order that followed sounded like pure, reckless absurdity. "Throw it on the ground." The moment that wood hits the packed desert dirt, the impossible happens. The inanimate object springs to life, morphing into a lethal force. The staff writhes. Wood gives way to cold scales, and in the blink of an eye, a venomous snake is coiled at the shepherd's feet. The shock was so brutal that the biblical text is dead honest. Moses himself ran away in absolute terror, violently backing away from his own tool. That thing slithering in the sand was a direct message from above. God was proving, right then and there, that he didn't need sophisticated arsenals to bring the greatest empire on earth to its knees. Then comes the second command, testing the very limits of human logic. Reach out your hand and take it by the tail. Any country boy knows that's a surefire recipe for disaster. But here, obedience had to completely subvert human reason. When that trembling, aging hand grabs the tail of that living threat, the flesh hardens. Scales turn back into splinters. Venom reverts to dried sap. It was exactly what it used to be. But catch this critical detail. The physical makeup might have been the same, but the core essence of that object had been irreversibly altered. That staff underwent an upgrade no human technology could ever replicate. That ordinary piece of wood, once used only to herd sheep and fend off lone wolves, was reclassified by the heavens. It was now the staff of God. This wasn't some magic relic. It was the physical extension of divine judgment on earth. The man who just fled in terror was now packing his bags, ready to return with the biological trigger of the Egyptian apocalypse right in his hands. And if you're feeling the weight of this revelation, if you get that God uses the smallest details to deliver massive victories against all odds, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your name and age down below. Because I read every single comment and I really want to know who's following the Word of God with us. When the heavy, monumental doors of Pharaoh's palace swung open, the cultural and visual shock must have been deafening. Try to picture the scene through the lens of historical reality. Forget the stiff cardboard sets of old Hollywood movies. We are talking about the undisputed epicenter of the ancient world. Polished limestone floors gleamed like a pool of water. Massive columns, dozens of feet high, were plated in gold and carved with hieroglyphs, boasting the bloody victories of ruthless gods. The air was thick, suffocating, heavy with the sweet scent of imported incense and the endless smoke of rituals for the gods and the dead. Egyptian architecture wasn't just built to look pretty. It was a cold, calculated machine, both military and psychological, designed to crush the soul and the courage of any foreigner. It screamed power. It told anyone crossing those doors, "You are nothing before the living God sitting on this throne." And who was slowly walking down that intimidating hallway? Two old men from the middle of nowhere, Moses and his brother, Aaron. They weren't wearing fine Egyptian linen. They had no jewelry. They flaunted no military ranks and carried no sharp spears. They looked like two exhausted outsiders, disposable pawns on a geopolitical chessboard, about to go head-to-head with the most powerful, wealthy, and dangerous man on the planet. The visual contrast bordered on the absolutely ridiculous. But Moses knew those walls intimately. He grew up in that toxic environment. He knew exactly how Pharaoh's mind worked. He knew the crushing bureaucracy and the blind arrogance of the Egyptian machine. And that is exactly why this approach couldn't be some polite diplomatic request. The showdown narrated in Exodus chapter 7 wasn't a formal sit-down. It was an all-out declaration of war. When those two old shepherds demanded the immediate release of millions of Hebrew slaves, threatening the very foundation of the country's free labor and economy, Pharaoh's silence must have been cut by a smirk of pure mockery. The monarch, from the heights of his divine arrogance, basically asks to see their credentials. It's as if he's saying, "Prove who sent you. Show me your power. Who is this God that dares give me orders inside my own house?" Pharaoh thought he was dealing with a couple of peasants, driven mad by the scorching sun. But he was about to find out he had just triggered an irreversible ticking time bomb. Without saying a single word to justify himself, Aaron takes a step forward. He raises that old, rugged wooden staff and, with a firm, calculated motion, hurls it onto the flawless palace floor. The dry crack of wood hitting solid stone echoed through the great hall. And in that exact second, the laws of physics bent the knee. Dead cellulose twisted. The color of aged wood suddenly went dark, and dry fibers morphed into cold scales. All of a sudden, there wasn't a harmless piece of wood on the ground. There was an aggressive, lightning-fast snake, coiled to strike, hissing directly at Pharaoh's throne. The object that once guided peaceful sheep in the desert was now a lethal biological threat planted right in the heart of the empire. The original Hebrew text uses a fascinating word to describe this serpent: tannin. It translates to a massive venomous reptile, or even a sea monster. It symbolized raw, uncontrollable, chaotic power. Any monarch of a lesser nation would have screamed for the guards, drawn swords, and backed away in terror. But not Pharaoh. Egypt was the undisputed global capital of the occult and the mystic arts. Pharaoh simply didn't take the bait. With a dismissive wave, like swatting away an annoying fly, he calls in his spiritual shock troops, the elite wise men, charmers, and necromancers of Egypt. History and documentary records show these guys weren't cheap street hustlers doing tricks for spare change. They were top-tier scholars of the dark arts, doctors in illusion, venom manipulation, and heavy witchcraft. The luxurious palace turned into a literal arena of psychological warfare. With the utmost calm, Pharaoh's magicians shrug it off, throw their own ornate staffs to the ground, and through their secret arts and optical illusions, the impossible happens again. Multiple snakes materialize out of nowhere, slithering across the polished floor of the royal court. Imagine the unbearable tension cutting through the room. The scene looked like a depressing dead-even tie. Pharaoh must have leaned back in his throne, shaken his head, and thought, "Is that it? A little parlor trick my own government employees can copy in 5 seconds? You really think you're going to break the economic backbone of Egypt with a cheap magic show?" To the Egyptian military and religious elite, Moses was just a washed-up old man crying out for attention. The empire's confidence was through the roof. Pharaoh's guard was completely down. The serpent, let's not forget, was the symbol of the Egyptian crown, the protector deity that supposedly breathed fire on the nation's enemies. That whole theatrical display seemed to be completely, 100% under Egypt's control. And it's exactly in that gap of profound arrogance that the divine checkmate happens. God let the Egyptian magicians put on their big show for one reason: to publicly humiliate them right inside their own stronghold. Suddenly, with brutal and relentless force, Aaron's serpent, the physical extension of God's judgment, ignores every natural animal instinct of flight and launches a full frontal assault. This wasn't some territorial wildlife dispute. It was an absolute massacre. The snake born from desert wood unhinges its jaws and, with methodical violence, swallows the elite sorcerer's serpents whole, one by one. The cannibal cobra absolutely cleaned house in the royal hall. When the dust settled and a morbid, terrifying silence fell over the palace, reality swallowed the monarch's pride. Only one creature was left on the floor. Aaron's snake was right there, alive, massive, and completely intact, while all the supposed dark power of the Egyptian empire now sat useless at the bottom of its stomach. Without flinching, Aaron calmly reaches down and grabs the creature. Instantly, the flesh hardens back into a rugged wooden staff. The message was delivered loud and clear. Even if he didn't want to admit it, Pharaoh felt the gut punch. The absolute best magic the richest empire on earth could produce was disposable garbage compared to the crushing, uncontrollable power of the desert. The gods of Egypt had just been chewed up and spit out by the God of Israel, right on the palace living room rug. There was no tie. That moment wasn't a theological debate. It was an eviction notice. That piece of wood came to tear down an empire. That terrifying standoff in the throne room was just a calling card. Shielded by absolute power, Pharaoh swallowed the bitter pill of his elite magician's defeat. But he absolutely refused to fold. In the Egyptian monarch's mind, a snake eating other snakes was a neat trick, sure, but it was just an exotic anomaly. It didn't actually threaten his regime. Pharaoh thought the game ended right there. What he didn't know And what the military history of the ancient world was about to record in the most traumatic way possible was that the piece of wood in Moses' hands wasn't some cheap parlor prop. It was about to become the most lethal, surgical, and devastating weapon of mass destruction in antiquity. That staff was the trigger for a full-blown biological and environmental apocalypse against Egypt. To grasp the mechanics of this power, we have to completely change how we look at warfare. The great generals of the past conquered territories by marching with thousands of infantrymen, archers, heavy cavalry, and siege engines that took months to break down enemy walls. It was a bloody, costly, and dragged-out process. Moses, on the other hand, didn't have a single soldier under his command. He didn't need to forge swords. He didn't need to train militias or set up ambushes against Pharaoh's patrols. The divine battle strategy was infinitely superior and utterly humiliating. The target wasn't the Egyptian army itself. It was the very backbone of the empire, its infrastructure, its economy, and its pantheon of gods. And all of it was going to be brought down by a simple wave of that dead wood. The book of Exodus, in chapter 7, chronicles the first massive national-scale attack. Pharaoh went down to the banks of the Nile River in the morning. And here we need a dose of historical reality. The Nile wasn't just a muddy waterway. It was the beating heart of Egypt. It was the Wall Street of the ancient world. It irrigated the crops, fed the population, drove commerce, and bankrolled the entire nation's wealth. More than that, the Nile was worshipped as a living deity, the god Hapi, who supposedly brought life and prosperity to the kingdom. Moses doesn't send an army to surround the river. He just casually walks up to the water's edge, face to face with Pharaoh and his royal entourage. On God's orders, Moses tells Aaron to raise that staff and, with a simple, raw motion dripping with authority, strike the sacred waters of the Nile. The exact millisecond that dead desert wood collides with the surface of the river, nature goes into total meltdown. An instant, catastrophic chain reaction takes over. The water doesn't just change color. It alters its very molecular structure. The entire river, from end to end, turns into thick, dark blood. And we aren't talking about a localized stain. Think about the biological and logistical nightmare. Irrigation canals, reservoirs, stone and wooden jars sitting inside Egyptian homes, everything was contaminated. The fish, a massive staple of the country's diet, died by the millions. The biblical record states the river gave off an unbearable stench of rot, a sickening smell of death that spread like an invisible plague across the nation, making the water undrinkable. With a single swing, that piece of wood annihilated the drinking water supply, wiped out the fishing industry, and publicly humiliated the supreme god of the Egyptian economy. The desperation was so intense that Egyptians were forced to dig holes in the parched earth along the riverbanks, begging for just a drop of clean water. But the pharaonic machine was stubborn. The hardness of the monarch's heart demanded that the desert arsenal be cranked up to terrifying new levels. The very same staff stopped aiming at the water and pointed straight up at the heavens. Moses didn't need catapults to bombard the cities of Egypt. He just held the staff high, turning that wooden rod into a makeshift satellite dish that caught and funneled divine wrath directly into the atmosphere. The local weather patterns completely snapped. Heavy, pitch-black clouds blotted out the unforgiving African sun, and an indescribable terror rained down. A massive hailstorm, with chunks of ice heavy enough to crush men and livestock, pounded the cities. But the sheer absurdity didn't stop there. The text in Exodus reports that a continuous, unexplainable fire flashed back and forth, mingling with the ice. It was a terrifying weather anomaly. The fire didn't melt the hail, and the hail didn't put out the fire. Pointed at the sky, the staff shredded everything left out in the open. It pulverized the nation's flax and barley crops, crippling the textile and food industries with a sheer violence that left nothing standing. The economy was in shambles. The people were terrified. But Pharaoh's pride still held the entire country hostage. So, the staff is deployed one more time to deliver the absolute death blow to Egyptian agriculture. Moses extends the piece of wood again. A supernatural east wind kicks up, howling continuously for a full day and night. The staff acted as the master switch for an apocalyptic plague. Locusts. And this wasn't your average swarm. It was a cloud so dense, so dark, and so monstrously colossal that it literally blotted out the sun, plunging the land of Egypt into pitch blackness in the middle of the day. The sound of billions of jaws devouring the vegetation was absolutely deafening. They didn't leave a single green leaf. They stripped every piece of fruit from the trees. They devoured whatever wheat had miraculously survived the hail. The country was picked clean to the bone, reduced to a massive dust bowl of total desolation. The mechanics of power were now crystal clear for anyone paying attention. No swords clashed. Not a single drop of Israelite blood was spilled on a battlefield. The entire pantheon of Egypt's fake gods was systematically humiliated, and the most sophisticated financial, agricultural, and military system on Earth was completely dismantled and gutted by an 80-year-old man who simply raised, pointed, and struck with an old piece of wood. That staff proved the power wasn't in the physical matter of the object itself. The power lay in that wood's absolute, terrifying submission to the voice of the Creator. Egypt was already in ruins, but the climax of this story was holding back an aquatic terror the world would never forget. At first glance, the escape felt like the ultimate relief for a nation that had spent over 4 centuries under the ruthless crack of a whip, mixing mud and hauling stones to feed the vanity of pharaohs. But the joy of breathing free air for the first time was incredibly short-lived. The logistics of moving more than 2 million people across a scorching desert was no joke. We aren't talking about a highly disciplined army marching in formation. These were entire families. Old folks dragging their tired feet, kids crying from thirst, and an endless trail of livestock crossing a totally unforgiving wasteland. To human intelligence and the military strategists of the day, the chosen route looked like a fatal miscalculation. They ended up completely cornered in what looked like the perfect mousetrap. On one side, the punishing vastness of the desert. On the other, towering walls of steep, rocky mountains, impossible to climb for a vulnerable crowd. And right in front of them, completely blocking their only horizon of escape, the dark, churning expanse of the Red Sea. The claustrophobia setting in over the camp was absolutely suffocating. While the exhausted, dust-covered crowd tried to pitch their tents in the sand, the ground started to shake in a way that sent chills down the spine of every man and woman standing there. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the rhythmic, piercing, deadly sound of antiquity's most ruthless war machine closing in fast right behind them. Pharaoh, his heart calloused by humiliation and blinded by a bloodthirsty pride, decided he wasn't going to take the loss. He rallied the absolute cream of the crop of his military cavalry, hand-picking the iron chariots, the elite strike force of the Egyptian Empire. Those chariots were the literal tanks of the ancient world, custom-built to slice through enemy infantry. When that colossal sandstorm of approaching chariots rose on the horizon, panic swept through the Israelite camp like a wildfire. The crowd, having a complete nervous breakdown, cornered Moses. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the desert? Always, The cold, hard math of survival left zero loopholes. It was the end of the line. At the epicenter of this emotional meltdown, God's response rips through the despair in a way that completely defies military logic. The directive documented in the book of Exodus borders on the absurd. The Lord basically asks him, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to march forward." The catch? Marching forward meant stepping directly into a dark, churning ocean. But right on the heels of that, the bizarre tactical order drops. Raise your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide the water. Pay close attention to the mechanics here. The trigger for the greatest feat of natural engineering in human history rested in the hands of an old man gripping a rugged stick. Moses didn't scream magic spells at the water. He faced the fury of the sea, felt the biting saltwater wind against his face, and firmly raised that worn-out piece of wood toward the impenetrable horizon. The exact second the staff pointed at the sea, the physical universe bowed its knee. A terrifying atmospheric violence was detonated. A dark, heavy, and aggressive east wind plummeted from the heavens. A gale engineered with mathematical precision to slice the ocean wide open. The roar must have been deafening, drowning out the screams of the Hebrews and the shrieks of the horses. Guided by the invisible authority of that simple piece of wood, the waters began to contort against gravity. The very structure of the ocean ruptured. The Red Sea was literally cracked right down the middle. Millions of tons of water were hurled aside. The scripture records that the waters formed literal walls, colossal barriers of pure liquid towering on the right and the left. Think about the incalculable pressure held back by an invisible dam, and the seabed was instantly baked dry by the sheer heat of the east wind, exposing a solid, dry highway right through the depths. That ordinary object was now acting as the master key of salvation for millions. And later, when Pharaoh's elite shock troops charged blindly into that aquatic canyon looking for blood, it only took one downward motion of that same staff in Moses' hand. The walls collapsed, and the crushing weight drowned the pride of an entire empire at the bottom of the sea. But the history of this piece of wood hides a dark twist, a brutal reminder that divine power is not a toy. Time passed. That sea, ripped in half, became just a distant memory for a generation that grew accustomed to complaining about everything. Years of marching under an unforgiving sun take their toll, and the psychological wear and tear of leading a nation of perpetually dissatisfied people began to eat away at even the meekest man on earth. Cut to the arid wilderness of Zin, a place where dust and thirst will drive anyone mad. The people, throats parched and patience completely gone, mount yet another fierce rebellion against Moses. The scene described in Numbers chapter 20 is one of pure exhaustion. Moses is old, fed up, and literally hanging by a thread before completely losing it. It's in this moment of extreme tension that God gives a very specific order. He tells Moses to take that historic staff, gather the people in front of a massive rock, and, pay close attention to this surgical detail, speak to the rock to yield its water. The instruction was crystal clear. It left zero margin for error. Just speak. But the crushing pressure of the moment swallowed his obedience. When Moses stands before that mutinous mob, his blood boils. Decades of bottled-up frustration explode all at once. Instead of projecting the calm, commanding authority of the divine voice, he screams at them with absolute contempt, calling them rebels, and takes the credit for the miracle himself. Blinded by rage, he grips the exact same weapon that shattered the legs of the Egyptian empire and violently strikes the rock. Not once, but twice. That wasn't an act of faith. It was the physical outburst of a man pushed to his breaking point, using the tool of God as a release valve for his own human wrath. The water gushed out in abundance. The miracle happened anyway. After all, God wasn't going to let his people die of thirst just because a leader messed up. But the judgment dropped like an anvil. The sentence was immediate and ruthless. The staff was never a magic wand that worked on autopilot. Its exclusive fuel source was the blind obedience of the man holding it. By twisting God's command and hijacking divine authority to stroke his own bruised ego, Moses crossed a point of no return. The man who defied Pharaoh, who bent the laws of physics, and who survived the greatest terrors of the ancient world, lost his right to set foot in the Promised Land. A single flash of anger cost him the prize of a lifetime. On that tragic day in the desert, the very tool that once brought liberation sealed its bearer's harshest doom. The final chapter of the Staff of Moses leaves us with a lesson that echoes through the millennia, crashing head-on into our modern arrogance. We live in an era where strength is measured by the size of your arsenal, the thickness of your bank account, or the high-level contacts in your phone. The world teaches us that to win massive battles, you need cutting-edge gear and a gigantic infrastructure. But the true story of that rugged piece of wood in the desert is the ultimate, undeniable proof that God simply does not play by our rules. He doesn't need heavily equipped armies. He doesn't rely on decorated generals. And he absolutely doesn't use fairy tale magic relics to execute his will on earth. The absolute genius of this divine tactic lies in its terrifying simplicity. God has a habit of ignoring what society applauds and reaching for what the world throws away. He looks at an 80-year-old exiled, discredited shepherd, a man carrying the bitter taste of failure, and chooses him. He takes the most ordinary, commercially worthless object imaginable, a piece of wood baked by the relentless sun, and turns it into the trigger for his judgment. The message is brutally clear. When the simple, the rejected, and the ordinary are placed in the hands of someone entirely submitted to the Creator, the most untouchable empires on earth crumble like sand castles. The glory never belonged to the wood. The glory always belonged to the voice that commanded it. Yet, the tragedy in the wilderness of Zin stands as a heavy warning. God's power, when manifested in our lives, is not a trophy meant to stroke our egos. It comes with a massive, terrifying responsibility: exact obedience. We cannot take the tools heaven entrusts to us and use them to vent our own anger or try to force our own flawed, heavy-handed justice. That staff brought down Pharaohs, but when wielded in rebellion, it locked its own master out of the Promised Land. It's a severe warning that intimacy with divine power demands non-negotiable reverence. If this raw dive into the true history of the Word impacted your perspective today, if it helped you realize that the Lord uses the little you have in your hands to pull off the impossible, don't leave without making your mark. Drop a like right now, because it helps the channel push this truth out to more people. Hit subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into biblical history, and let me know down in the comments what hit you the hardest in this story. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.